Okay, so we'll get started. I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Kalenda Eaton. Dr. Eaton is a professor in the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She is a humanities scholar whose research focuses on African American Western regional studies, the intersections of Black literary studies and cultural history, and women's studies. She is currently director of Oklahoma research for the Black Homesteader Project, a project that I highly recommend that you check out. She received graduate degrees from The Ohio State University and an undergraduate degree from Dillard University. So Dr. Eaton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today to moderate a wonderful panel of up-and-coming scholars, thank you, up-and-coming scholars under the title Real and Imagined Black Communities. I feel like all of the scholars are my students, but two are actually, have been in my classes at the University of Oklahoma, and then one, Mr. Cherry, has, I don't know, we're on like this circuit, right, at different conferences and what have you, where I end up either moderating a panel or working with him in some way, shape, or form. So what I'm going to do is introduce all three of them now, given the fact that we don't have a lot of time for the full session, and then in the order in which you see, introduce them in the order in which you see on the screen, and then each one will come up and present, and then hopefully we'll have time for robust Q&A at the end. Does that sound good? You all with me out there? Okay. So the first presenter, I have to read my own notes. Anthony Cherry is a passionate educator, writer, and historian dedicated to uncovering the stories that shape our world. He currently teaches seniors, sophomores, and juniors, I think, right, at Holland Hall Episcopal School in Tulsa, where he brings United States history, African American studies, and the history of domestic terrorism in the United States to life for his students. His commitment to education began in the historic Greenwood District, where he taught at Booker T. Washington High School on the subject of Black Wall Street. With a deep-seated love for community engagement, Anthony has published historical articles, curated public forums, and developed innovative curricula. As a PhD student at Oklahoma State University currently, he is focused on the American West and war and society, with a particular interest in the radical social, political, and educational reform movements of Oklahoma's progressive era. After Anthony, we will have Ben Folger, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Oklahoma. He studies the history of medicine in the American West, and his dissertation examines how white physicians and medical officials enacted settler colonial medical violence toward Native peoples in Oklahoma, and how those Native peoples resisted and retooled settler medicine for their own benefit. And today he's presenting on a portion of a larger project that focuses on an African-American doctor. And then last but not least, we have Elizabeth Thomas, who is currently the archive specialist, and I'm pausing because she recently graduated, and so she has this wonderful job, yes, congratulations, Elizabeth, as an archive specialist at Oklahoma State University. And so she was a student at the University of Oklahoma, and she received a degree in history and library studies and a graduate certificate in archival studies. Her research interests broadly include race and Indian territory, with a specific focus on all Black rural communities in Eastern Oklahoma, and her work that she will present today is on the town of Huttonville. Right? Okay. Welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Eaton. I really love what I do, and I hope I can engage you with my research today. I am focusing on the imaginary black town of Norris City, the Greenwood secession movement of 1922. 1 year after the smoke cleared from the ruins of the Tulsa Race Massacre, a white-owned weekly called the American Saturday Night issued a warning. Negroes of Tulsa evidently want to govern their own city. This report wasn't mere rumor. It was the first public account of a radical proposition, a secessionist movement of disenchanted black Tulsans seeking to establish Norris City, an independent, all-black municipality beyond the reaches of Tulsa's hostile jurisdiction. While mainstream media of 1922 viewed this petition with a mix of gall and derision, my research argues that the Norris City movement represented a sophisticated political response to structural devastation. Today, I want to highlight the unique history of this movement, the creative methodology I used to map this existence, and my contributions to the evolving historiography of the Tulsa Race Massacre. To understand Norris City, we must first situate it within Oklahoma's unique sovereign frontier. Before statehood in 1907, the Twin Territories served as an experimental laboratory for black nationalism and black separatist ideologies. This lineage stretched from Edward P. McCabe's vision of a black-governed state to Chief Alfred Sam's Pan-Africanist logistics. By 1922, however, the Promised Land had been re-territorialized into one of the most politically successful Ku Klux Klan realms in the post-World War era, asked Russell Cobb. In this context, the proposal of Norris City was not a spontaneous act of disillusionment. It was a strategically rational response to the institutional denial of wealth. Following the massacre, the city of Tulsa employed predatory fire codes, industrial rezoning, and insurance claims to initiate a concentrated phase of asset stripping. My research utilizes a specific creative methodology of geospatial reconstruction, and I sought to anchor this imaginary town in the physical reality of modern-day Tulsa. In 1922, the petition focused on a 160-acre tract of land that would occupy the heart of modern North Tulsa. Had it succeeded, the space of Norris City would span around the areas of North Peoria and North Lewis and East 46th Street North and East 56th Street North. Today's landmarks might be O'Brien Park and the Northgate Shopping Center. My primary contribution to this historiography focuses on the shift from the narrative, moving from the emphasis of resilience to a modern conclusion of structural devastation. For decades, the story of Greenwood was one of the Phoenix Rising, how the community rebuilt despite the odds. However, recent cliometric analysis, the application of quantitative economic data, has fundamentally changed the way we look at the results of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The 2021 study, After the Burning, laboriously quantified the event's structural fallout, and researchers found the massacre caused a persistent, measurable decline in black home ownership and occupational status that continues today. The destruction was not an acute incident followed by recovery. It was an initial phase of multi-decade process of economic marginalization. Here is where the Norris City movement becomes vital. While modern economists can now quantify the occupational downgrading through the hindsight of the century, the 1922 Norris City petitioners were the first to identify these structural traps as they were being set. Norris City emerged not as a whimsical fantasy, but as a lucid, real-time rejection to this system that had been predatory to black wealth. We must view Norris City as the final manifestation of Oklahoma's separatist tradition. It represents a synthesis of its predecessors, like Edwin B. McCabe and Chief Sam. They viewed this as an exit, as an economic necessity. But unlike the early agrarian or global movements, Norris City was a modern urban secession. It was fueled by the radicalization of Black political thought in the early 1920s, the new Negro philosophy. Figures like A.J. Smitherman of the Tulsa Star had embodied this new Negro philosophy, and he synthesized it into economic self-reliance and militant civil rights in his publication. This domestic militancy was sharpened by the First World War. In Tulsa, this radicalism transformed into this tract near Tulsa, Oklahoma, into a laboratory for Black radicalism. And here, so in 1922, the Get Together Protective League, or the GTPL, transitioned into a radical political engine led by E. Norris Bryant, a congressional candidate, a pastor, and a formal candidate for U.S. Senate. The movement submitted a formal petition to Governor Robertson. Here is E. Norris Bryant. This petition bore approximately 2,000 signatures. Bryant's vision for Norris City was not a nebulous colony, but a highly structured technocratic city-state. He sought to create a sovereign loop of basic services that would bypass Tulsa's extraction. First, Bryant's plan for Norris City included an independent post office and a dedicated mail routing system. By controlling the mail, the community could ensure that Black business communications and relief funds were not intercepted or surveilled by the hostile Tulsa postmaster. Second, Bryant recognized that whoever controlled the water and lights controlled the people. He proposed purchasing water directly from Sand Springs and the electricity from Public Service Company of Oklahoma, effectively building an independent grid. This would have protected residents from having their utilities shut off as a form of political coercion or being taxed into poverty for infrastructure that never reached their streets. Third, the site offered topographic superiority. Unlike Deep Greenwood, which was sat in a low-lying area, the North Peoria Ridge offered higher elevation. The plan called for an independent police force of 16 officers, 8 that would work in the day, 8 who would work at night, and armed Black citizens who would replace the special deputies who had orchestrated the 1921 assault. However, the failure of Norris City movement was not an organic collapse. It was a result of calculated institutional, something called a pincer movement. A pincer maneuver is be found in military history, a tactical enclosure designed to render the movement's survival strategy psychologically and economically. Historically employed by tactical legends like Hannibal, the pincer seeks to surround the opposition force on all sides, replacing the need for brute force with a sense of crushing inevitability. The dual-fronted attack captured the platform of the conversation. It created a no-win scenario for the Get Together Protective League, who supported this petition and was forced to defend its legitimacy rather than its policy. It was actually the wealthiest Black Tulsans who were the other part of the pincer movement, not just white Oklahoma, but the wealthiest land-wealthy Oklahomans in Tulsa. The movement was trapped between the structural legal barriers of white establishment and the economic self-preservation of Black elite. The game had been rigged from the start. In conclusion, the failure of the Norris City movement was the final enclosure of the sovereign frontier in Oklahoma. The economic exploitation that followed, the occupational downgrading, the forced liquidation of land was exactly what the petitioners warned us against in 1922. They saw the marked spot for industrial expansion long before it was realized. So by recovering this history, we see the 1921 massacre was not an isolated event of mob violence, but the catalyst for a successful policy of economic elimination. Norris City represents the foreclosed alternative. It reminds us that the quest for Black municipality autonomy and grassroots activism is not a whimsical dream, but a sophisticated weapon against white supremacy and economic empowerment. Thank you.
Okay. So in the third novel of the series, Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder recounts when she was either 3 or 4, picking berries from bushes in, quote, the Indian Territory. And while the Ingalls were certainly in Indian country, they were actually located in present-day Montgomery County, Kansas, on the Osage Diminished Reserve. Laura noted that that summer had been particularly bad for mosquitoes, so bad that when her father, Pa, he tried to burn damp grass to stave off the mosquitoes at night. Yet, as she recounts, the entire family came down with fever and aches. Presumably, it was malaria, and in between Laura's hazy visions in the book, she hears their family dog, Jack, pawing, whining, and howling at the entire family who lay ill in bed. His howling, as she writes, worked, as when she awoke, she saw a, quote, big black face close above her face, coal black and shiny. Its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. The face smiled and a deep voice said softly, quote, drink this, little girl, end quote. A few days pass, and when the doctor returns, he was, quote, the black man. She had never seen a black man before, let alone a black doctor, she claimed. And the doctor was George A. Tan, a, quote, doctor with the Indians, as Laura wrote, and had it not been for he and Jack, their dog, who knows what might have come of the Ingalls. So George Tan, with 2 N's, as his headstone reads, was a real doctor. He treated native, black, and white patients throughout southeastern Kansas, as well as in the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory. As some others have shown through various pieces, Tan was much more than, quote, a black doctor that doctored the Ingalls for malaria in 1870, as you can see his headstone reads. But much of what has been published about Tan can't help but to tie his life into this larger Ingalls ethos. So that's part of what this project does, right? So his career as both homesteader and physician was somewhat atypical and worth a resituating of its own. The Tans, George, and his parents were among the first waves of African Americans utilizing land openings in Kansas via the Homestead Act. And years before the most famous colony, Nicodemus, was formed in 1877, the Tans had settled some 350 miles to the southeast. They also took advantage of these settler colonial expansion processes, like the dispossession and sale of Osage land, while simultaneously benefiting from an established African American and Black Cherokee population in Indian Territory. As physician, Tan navigated this free territory in Kansas, as well as native land in Indian Territory, using another fact of the American West, the railroad that dissected his homestead. So ultimately, Tan's life is emblematic of this complex history of African Americans in the American West. And then, like I said, resituating and reevaluating his life in this context helps us ask other questions about homesteading, of race, of early medicine in what becomes Oklahoma. That's much different than the account that Laura gives in the 1930s with her best-selling books. So George was born in Pennsylvania in 1835. Not 1825 like his headstone reads. Here, his father Bennett had worked on a farm, but we don't know what caused him and his wife to pack up with George and migrate to Kansas after the Civil War. Presumably, George was a soldier in a Pennsylvania regiment where he may have studied under a surgeon and maybe heard about free land ceded by the Osage in Kansas. But at any rate, he left his first wife and first-born son in Pennsylvania and moved with his father and mother across the country in 1869. So they weren't from the South, they weren't enslaved, they weren't escaping the Reconstruction South, right? They weren't part of the Exodusters in 1879, but rather they're drawn to Kansas for this true freedom of owning land and homesteading and settled in Montgomery County, Kansas, excuse me. So the Tan's claims, right, to these seemingly opened plots really hinged on this dispossession and these settler colonial processes, right? And despite the boosterism that drew thousands of settlers to the region, it was still Osage land until 1872. So for 2 years while they, settled, there's all these claims about whose land belonged to whom. And then once the Osages and federal government finalized their sale, George applies for 160 acres, which you can see on the left here. His father, Bennett, applies for 80 acres in January, and then George pays $200 cash for his homestead, expands his farm even further 2 months later with $400 cash to buy the homestead of Anderson and Emma Carroll, also black homesteaders, like I said, just 2 months after this initial purchase. So he spends the next 40 years or so homesteading this land, acquiring more property throughout South Dakota, Arkansas, and Independence, Kansas. So he swears he was single at the time of this application and soon married his next wife, Eliza. They had 2 daughters before this 1875 census, which you can see here. Tan is that first underlined line, and then below it, the third underline, if you can see, that's the Ingalls, so suggesting they were on neighboring plots. So when Bennett Tan passes away, George's holdings grow further, and some at that point had claimed him to be the richest black man in the county. So while we don't know where he was medically trained, he did list his medical training as eclectic, which is essentially a quote, irregular style of practice that combines botanicals, physical therapy, and other remedies to treat patients. And his training wasn't atypical of the time, and certainly didn't stop him from growing his reputation, and perhaps his adjacency to native peoples with the Osage land helped impact his future treating Cherokees and black Cherokees, right, in Indian Territory. The Cherokee freedmen population certainly exacerbated this, right, with these communities, and allowed him to take the railroad nearly 40 miles south to Dewey. You can see my arrow here, where he treated and opened an office next door to the blacksmith shop on 9th and Delaware. That circle, it's white text, but that's where his approximate homestead was, and then his wife and daughters lived in Independence with that arrow. So despite his decades of medical experience in the West, he still operated in Cherokee Nation without a, quote, proper degree or certification. And according to the 1890 Medical and Surgical Register, in the Cherokee Nation, the principal chief was responsible for appointing a board of 3 physicians from some, quote, well-authenticated medical school and residents of the nation with the task of examining all persons who wish to practice medicine in Cherokee Nation who had located there, right? So would-be physicians had to apply in writing with references of their moral character, a written endorsement from 4 citizens of the Cherokee Nation, as well as a $25 examination fee, and then take the exam, right? So if they had passed, they'd get a certificate to practice for 1 year, and then they would have to renew that annually. But, quote, any person not a citizen and claiming to be a physician and failing to comply with the provisions of this act shall be deemed an intruder and dealt with accordingly. So Tan had presumably operated for several years before these regulations were published, and with his lack of diploma, non-Cherokee ancestry, and his eclectic medical training, he was seemingly this, quote, intruder. But that didn't stop Tan from forming relationships in Cherokee Nation within existing black communities. When his friend Samuel Beck, a Cherokee freedman, applied for an Indian community land claim just northeast of Bartlesville near Price Field on Tuxedo Boulevard, his friend George Tan came to him with an idea. His claim lay on the Caney River, which you can kind of see in this middle picture. And to help Beck prove his claim, right, so he would own it, he built a hospital house. And this, so when Tan would move away and forego his practice, everything on that property, including the hospital house, its fields, et cetera, would go back to Beck. In return, he would qualify for land ownership. So in the late 1890s, his hospital house soon housed various patients from the area. And you can see in those pictures there, and then Samuel Beck listed on the Freedman rolls. So by the end of the century, or the turn of the century, excuse me, more and more white physicians began to settle and practice medicine in Indian Territory, and perhaps as a result, a complaint was filed in March 1902 about tan practicing in Cherokee Nation. Indian agent J. Blair Schoenfeld wrote, quote, "You are informed that complaint is made to this office that you are practicing medicine in the Cherokee Nation in violation of Cherokee law." So Tan had 20 days after that to respond to the complaint, and he did so on March 24th, asking to appear before the medical board at its next session, pay the examination fee, and take the exam. He wrote, quote, "Pending my examination, I shall discontinue the practice of medicine." So at 67 years old, Tan, the quote intruder, was finally tracked down. So I haven't found it yet, but there aren't records that I've seen before the board to see what happens. Scholars speculate whether he appeared at all. But what we do know is that he returned to his properties in 1902. So Beck retains the hospital house. The Dewey office that he opened would go to another younger black doctor after he leaves. So throughout much of his medical career, he's separated from his wife, visits daily, and after one visit in 1909, he unhitches his team of horses and suffers a heart attack. So Tan passes away in 1909, and rumors about his death sort of riddle the newspapers in Independence, Kansas. Quote, "The venerable colored physician of exceptional mental qualities and ability had passed away with a, quote, comfortable fortune." In all, his estate was around $23,000. And there's a lot of back and forth in the newspapers about estate sales and probate court stuff. At any rate, just to wrap up, Tan's life and career as homesteader and physician in the West forces us to grapple with these issues of community building, of race relations, and processes of settler colonialism. So whether you agree with historian Elena Roberts, who claims that African Americans can participate as settler colonists, you have to grapple with the fact that the Tans certainly benefited from some of these practices, but the benefits of that only went so far, as I've noted. At the surface, sure, the Ingalls are the public's exposure to this foreignness of a black man who was, quote, doctor to the Indians. But Tan's life is as part of this larger legacy and story of the American West, of black migration in search of freedom, and the development of the American medical profession. So when we attempt to remove the Ingalls from that story, we ask larger, different questions about the Tans, their black neighbors who he bought their homestead, the young black doctor who moved into his Dewey office, and even Samuel Beck, who inherited the hospital house. Thank you.
All right. Huttonville is one of more than 50 all-black towns that have dotted Oklahoma's landscape from before the state's founding to the present day. The town was founded by Joseph Hutton Sr. and lies roughly 4 miles northwest of Eufaula. From its founding, it has been an exceptionally small town, numbering 121 families at its height in 1919, and scholars consistently overlook it in their study of black towns. So little is known about it, in fact, that Hannibal Johnson's expansive work on Oklahoma black towns, Acres of Aspiration, only includes 3 sentences on the supposed ghost town and claims that the town now lies beneath Lake Eufaula. Except Huttonville is not abandoned or underwater. Descendants of Joseph Hutton Sr. still live in the area, but the story of Hutton and his family, who collectively owned over 2,000 acres of land, is often overlooked in Oklahoma's history. Uncovering Huttonville's past allows us to see a rich, underexplored history, one that examines the longer of history of black towns in Oklahoma that predates the state itself by nearly 50 years. In 1896, when Huttonville's post office was founded, the towns its citizens lived in before had been around for roughly 30 years. Huttonville was new in name, but its community already had firm roots in the area. They adapted their former Muskogee settlements and towns into American townships to keep steady their access to land and their ways of life. Muskogee or Creek peoples began adopting chattel slavery around the time of the Revolutionary War. The number of Muskogees holding slaves increased during the war and rose until forced removal in the 1830s. On Nene Estameriku, enslaved people walked alongside Muskogees, experiencing the same hardships. And in By the 1830s, the status of enslavement began to be inherited so that entire families were subject to enslavement. These are the conditions that Joseph Hutton was born into. Hutton was born to Jim Chinny Chotke and Venus Grayson, who were both enslaved by Robert Grierson, who later became Grayson. Grierson treated Jim and Venus as fungible. He transferred Jim, Venus, and their 7 children to his daughter, Katie, in 1817, but separated Joseph from his parents and siblings by gifting him to Nancy, another young Grayson. After being separated from his parents, Joseph Hutton never again saw his father. Following the Civil War and his emancipation, Hutton went to find his father, but learned he had died in 1863. They missed each other by 1 year. Following the end of the Civil War in 1865, the United States government negotiated a new treaty with the Muskogee Nation. This treaty, adopted in 1866, required the nation to emancipate their enslaved population. Emancipation included not only freedom, but also adoption into the nation as full citizens. With these newfound freedoms, they became active participants in the social, political, and economic life of the nation. They cultivated land, accessing the famed 40 acres and a mule that freedmen in America never received. During the Reconstruction period, 3 African Creek towns emerged. Some African Creeks lived on land they had lived on before the war, and others found new places in the nation to live. These towns, Canadian-colored, North Fork-colored, and Arkansas-colored, that emerged during this period of resettlement served a different function than towns in American society. Huttonville was part of a town, or in Muskogee, Talwa, which in Muskogee culture described a body of people living in a number of settlements with one central settlement that contained a town square that served both administrative and cultural functions. The settlement hosted court and voting, and the square ground was used for cultural events like the Pasquita ceremony. Male citizens voted in the settlement to elect Mikos to represent their Talwas in the House of Kings, a branch of the National Council that formed in 1867 when the Muskogee Nation adopted a new constitution and government. This structure was adapted to fit the needs of the new 3-branch government structure the Muskogee Nation had adopted in 1867, but its roots are actually found in pre-contact Muskogee culture. The 3 African Creek Talwas, known in Muskogee as Canute Luslatu, Oktahuti Luslatu, and Akensa Luslatu, differed from the 11 traditional Muskogee Talwas because they lacked a square ground for ceremonial events. The African Talwas then functioned more as electoral districts that concentrated Black Creek voting power to protect their interests. However, the Talwas were more than simply administrative units. As in pre-removal culture, identification with a town was a marker of kinship. A Muskogee person identified who their family was and claimed, by identifying their Talwa, a Muskogee person identified who their family was and claimed Muskogee citizenship and further identity. Although they did lack a square ground, each of the African Creek Talwas had settlements where residents voted and collected annuity payments. So Arkansas corresponded with the settlements in the Arkansas Verdigris River Valley up here, and it's didn't have an official settlement center, but the largest concentration of African Creeks was in the settlement of Wybark, which is just north of Muskogee. The North Fork settlement included people who lived on settlements both on the North Fork and north and west of the Deep Fork of the Canadian River. Its center was originally at Fishertown, which is near present-day Eufaula, but it later moved to Lee. Canadians' geographic constraints were much more scattered. Some of the settlements were along the Canadian River, but others overlapped with North Fork settlements. Its headquarters were first at Lee and then moved to Prairie Edge, which is near present-day Holdenville. Joseph Hutton and his family were part of the Canadian Talwa, but some Huttonville residents were from North Fork. As Creek country became part of the Union and tribal sovereignty in the Muskogee Nation was overturned, the practical uses for Talwas faded, and the towns became a way to rhetorically claim citizenship as Muskogee. Many people during the late 1890s and early 1900s would describe themselves as being from 2 places, their Talwa and their American town, which was designated by the post office where they received their mail. These American towns, however, were not new places. They were instead communities that were leveraging federal township recognition to protect their all existing ways of life. In 1898, when Congress passed the Curtis Act, which abolished tribal courts and placed Indian Territory under the jurisdiction of the federal court system, and gave the Dawes Commission authority to prepare a set of citizenship rolls for the tribes in Indian Territory. In establishing these roles, commission members followed the Anglo-American legal precedent of racial hypodescent, also known as the one-drop rule, and in trying to create separate racial categories, the commissioners created two roles of citizens, by blood and freedmen. The commissioners' work of dividing Muskogee citizens into bybloods and freedmen was haphazard, and it actively facilitated Black Creek dispossession. Although many African Creeks had non-Black Muskogee heritage, being of African descent relegated them to the freedmen roles where they were presumed to have no indigenous blood. This not only undermined the Muskogee identity of African Creeks, but it also sped their dispossession. Through the racialized politics of competency, Congress released people without Indian blood from the trust period that prevented them from selling their land in 1904. This left every African Creek who had been enrolled as a freed person vulnerable to land speculator scams. When Joseph Hutton approached the Dawes Commission in 1901 to be enrolled, he began a 3-year-long process. This application process first required applicants to present their testimony to the commission. Commissioners would ask about their age, their talwa, whether they left the nation for any extended period of time, and any number of other questions they had. Commissioners then consulted existing citizenship roles. If the person was found on one of the many roles, they were admitted and given a citizenship certificate. But the trouble with Hutton was that he ostensibly had 2 last names, Grayson and Hutton. This is because the woman who enslaved him, Nancy, had the surname Grayson before she married Jim Hutton and took his name. Joseph at times claimed both of these names, Grayson and Hutton, which frustrated commissioners as they tried to verify his place on the rolls. When the commissioners asked Joseph Hutton if he had ever made an application to citizenship in the nation, he replied that he had not realized he needed to. He said, quote, "When I came back to this country, I was under the impression that it was my own country and had no idea that the question would ever be raised as to my citizenship." To Joseph Hutton, the question of his citizenship was no question at all. He was born to Jim Chinichaki Grayson, whom he described as half Indian and half colored. He was taken from his parents at a young age, but moved to Indian Territory. When the Civil War ended, he returned to the nation after being taken out of it by Nancy. His life may have occasionally taken him out of the nation, but he always returned because that was his home. However, since he had 2 last names and struggled to recall some of the details of his life due to his age, the commission vacillated over their decision. They closed and reopened his case twice before finally admitting him and getting him a citizenship certificate. After receiving this certificate, applicants went to a different office to select their allotments of land. For the Muskogee Nation, each citizen received a total of 160 acres, a homestead, and surplus land. Commissioners helping allottees make their land suggestion would encourage them to select their 2 pieces of land far apart from each other, sometimes by miles, to make it more difficult for allottees to consolidate their land. Separate land sections were not required, though, so many people either ignored the suggestion to claim separate land altogether or only allowed their land to be separated by their family members' allotments. For example, Pilot Hutton was one of Joseph's great-grandsons, received 2 separate 40-acre plots that sat on either side of his Uncle Alex's plot. And his allotment was further surrounded by other members of his family, James Jr., Amelia, Tuka, Louisa, and Dave. Pilot was only 10 months old when he was enrolled by his father, Everett, who made the land selection for him. Everett's own allotment was roughly 1.5 miles east of Pilot's, but the space between himself and his son was only occupied by family. The Huttons selected land throughout the nation, contiguous with the areas where they had lived in before allotment began. James Hutton, Joseph's son, chose allotments surrounded by his wife and their family. They made their selections between 1898 and 1900, cementing their claim to the town they had already founded. Scholars of the late 19th century generally identify a town as federally recognized if they meet one of 2 conditions: the construction of a post office or the presentation of an incorporation petition at a federal court. Huttonville's post office was established in 1896 with Alex Jasper Hutton, Joseph Hutton's grandson, as the first postmaster. By 1904, there was a school and a general store, but no town site. This meant that residents were either allottees or their tenants. A town site would allow Huttonville to open itself to development by non-allottees. On April 4th in 1904, Walter Hutton wrote a letter to George Wright, the BIA's Indian inspector for Indian Territory. Hutton wanted to see the sale restrictions lifted on his allotment in order to have the land platted into a town site. He wrote, "We have a store and a PO and a 9-month school. We want a town, and I am willing to sell my allotment for the same." The commissioner in charge, who wrote no name, wrote back 8 days later informing Hutton that the commission did not have the authority to restrict to lift the restrictions for Hutton to sell his land, and nothing seemed to ever come of it. The land was never platted into a town site, but it still attracted residents, mostly African Creeks, who sent their children to the local school, used the post office, and attended the New Hope Baptist Church, which is still active today. Although Huttonville's post office closed in 1915 and they never brought an incorporation petition to the government, the community remains active in Oklahoma. Some of the residents are still direct descendants of Joseph Hutton Sr., and they represent a contingent of African Creeks that have resided in the area since the 1830s. Thank you.
Thank you to all three. Would you like to come up to the front? We have only 5 minutes for questions, and so I think that maybe most of you will still be around a little bit because we have a break immediately following this session. So we have 3 very wonderful presentations that cover space, place, belonging, identity. And so I guess I'll ask a question maybe to kind of get us all thinking. And that really is one that only one of you probably needs to answer, but it's just more so of what did you learn kind of the most about your work and your research when you were conducting this research? What did you learn the most about Oklahoma?
Is this on? I don't think this is. Oh, no, it is. It's making noise. Hello. Okay.
You can give it to Anthony. How about that?
I'm happy to start. This was kind of a personal thing. I learned more about myself, my family, my father. I learned that I helped him build homes. He was a construction company. We built quite a few projects in North Tulsa. And as I'm learning about the boundaries of Norris City, I learned that I helped my father build a home on the boundaries within Norris City. I just learned that this weekend. And it's just so eye-opening, refreshing to know that history is living and it's therapeutic in some cases, just really to be able to understand myself and my family.
I think for me, I kind of touched on this in the presentation, but Oklahoma's history is so much longer than we tend to really acknowledge. When we think about Oklahoma being founded in 1907, but the people have been around for hundreds, thousands of years before that. So
I'm pretty early stage on this project and not sure where it fits dissertation-wise, but something that you said, Anthony, like that clicks about Oklahoma history is just like how experimental a lot of these projects were, just from like what I've seen, my own dissertation research and here, right, like this, in this case, right, this doctor sort of traversing these boundaries, forming communities in both, Kansas and in Indian Territory, and just like how, experimental a lot of these projects were in various, whether it be healthcare, whether it be, seceding as its own community, forming communities, right? That's just been what I've taken away.
Thank you. Questions? Yes. In the back, and then Ms. Najima.
Hi, y'all. First of all, thanks for being here. Thanks for sharing your work. It's really interesting. I kind of came up as a grad student with Kendra Field and Elena Roberts, reading them. So it's really interesting to hear more about African American and Afro-Indigenous history in Oklahoma, kind of fields that seem to be really cutting edge. So where would you say the direction of this field is going? I guess if that makes sense. Like where are we headed next? And that's kind of a big question, but I'm just curious. So.
I was going to say maybe one person answered that. That was just something.
Okay. For me, I hope it seems like it's getting more specific. We tend to talk about Afro-Indigeneity as kind of this like big thing instead of like something that is specific and different within different tribes and nations. So I'm hoping we'll get to see a more careful and close readings of different nations and what those look like across, different cultures instead of just, more generic.
Did you want to say something, Anthony? Mm-hmm.
Just briefly, I just remember as kids when we were told not to smoke, it actually encouraged several other people to want to try to smoke and to see what it was like. And I know that there are legislatures all around the South who are banning Black history, Indigenous history, all types of interesting histories. And I think that's just going to make people more curious and dig more into African American history, indigenous history. We'll hear more stories. More people will be in the archives because new history will be written.
Ms. Najima.
I want to go back before the question about the research. What was it about Black homesteading that appealed to you to the extent that you wanted to get a PhD on it and write your dissertation about it?
Well, interestingly enough, I worked with Dr. Eaton on the Black Homesteader Project, took a seminar with her, and just like really drawn to how like the rhetoric around it is like this pursuit of like true, real freedom in the ways that in various all black towns, and it's not about, right, like necessarily the towns that Elizabeth was talking about, but other places where homesteading is, prevalent. I just was really drawn to that. Most of my research deals with medicine and doctors, so like finding a homesteader who also is this doctor in Indian Territory, that was really drew me in. And then of course, right, like pushing back against what Laura Ingalls writes, that kind of drew me in. And I don't know if this is, fits into a chapter yet. This is sort of early stage. Maybe it's an article or something, right? But yeah, it's just kind of what drew me in.
I think we have time for one more question.
We've got one more.
Oh, just their research in general?
No, why they decided to, what was it about Black homesteading that made them, that appealed to them to want to do a dissertation and a PhD in this area?
Right, but only, okay, I think the other two are not working on homesteading though, so one is, but just maybe your research in general?
Sure. My research is on progressive era Oklahoma, 1920s, early 1930s, and I'm focusing on education history. I'm an education historian, and I'm looking into the Ku Klux Klan and how they shaped Oklahoma education policy, and how they actually built our education system here in Oklahoma, and why are we still operating within this system knowing this information? So those are some questions I'm grappling with for my dissertation.
I had finished my graduate studies, but I was really drawn to writing about Huttonville because when I first was researching it, the way it was written about it was like it didn't exist anymore. And then as I dug into it, I found it does. People are still there. People still live there and still claim Huttonville as their hometown. So I wanted to know how something like that could get lost and really figure out, what actually happened and what the history is.
Okay, final question, I think?
Hi. So kind of going off of that question, so I know for Anthony, you said that this was kind of more of a personal thing for you. You kind of relate to it at a very tangible level, right? And then for the other two, you kind of seem, this is just like it's something that you found within the archives. And I kind of just wanted to explore maybe a little bit about writing history that's kind of really personal to you and how that guides you, and then maybe on the other side is like, okay, I'm doing archive work, I'm doing this, and then kind of following that thread line without really necessarily having a personal connection to that.
When I started the research, I did not realize I had a personal connection. It was just this weekend when I was drawing the borders and the maps for this. And, as a Black Oklahoman, it's very personal. This history as an Oklahoman, regardless of my race, this history should be very personal. This is our state. The outside world is looking in at how we were shaped and how we tell the story of how this land was shaped. So it is very personal to me, but it became extra personal this weekend. So thank you for your question.
Yeah, for me, like not an Oklahoman, from upper Midwest, come down here for grad school in 2020. I've been here 5.5 years. And I just keep getting drawn into some of these stories. I did a project a few years ago about the first, cooperative hospital that's in, Elk City in the 20s and 30s. So I'm just like keep getting drawn into these like super interesting stories that like center Oklahoma in this like larger story about the American West, about the United States. And like I said, right, I've been here for over 5 years. It is, a home to me. So, finding ways to have that involvement, this community involvement, and I think it's just, Oklahoma history is just super important to tell. And like I said, it's just, lens where you can, extrapolate all these different processes and things in U.S. history.
Yeah, I grew up in Norman, so I've lived in Oklahoma all of my life, and studying more about it and learning more about it is personal in the sense that I want to know more about my home, and I want this like rich, diverse history to be shared, especially at a time when people don't want us talking about diverse history and what's the truth is and who really is from Oklahoma and all of these things. And also, it was personal in the sense that I got to work with and talk to a lot of people for whom this story is personal. It's their family history. And so I got to be a vehicle to write about this and, you know, share it in like a repository or whatever so people can stumble upon it and see these family stories and personal histories explored and shared.
Thank you very much.